Hey everybody, welcome to the Los Angeles chapter of the California Receivers Forum Luncheon Education Program. This is our fourth and last education program of the year. First of all, we just want to thank everybody for coming out and supporting this organization and supporting this program. I promise you today is going to be a very interesting and education program. As I said, this is our last program of the year. Although we do have a holiday party that's coming up on December 1st from 4 to 7 p.m. and that's at Richard Ormond's residence. That's our end of the year networking and holiday party. I strongly encourage everybody to come to that. Richard has a beautiful house. And the food is just amazing that he serves every year.
Do you have a date on that, Kevin?
Yeah, that's December 1st, 4 to 7 p.m. That's our 9th annual holiday party. Also, Tony wanted me to mention that right now we're putting together the directory for the California Receivers Forum membership directory. That goes out to many of the judges in California. How many judges do we send that out to?
Send it to about 700.
About 700 judges throughout the state of California. There's ways to get your name in there, advertise your business. I use that directory often when I'm looking for specific counsel in specific region, or I'm looking for different types of vendors in that region because it breaks it down by different regions all throughout California. I think it's a great resource because, like I said, the judges have it and it's something for them to look at. And if they want to cross-check you to see if you're part of an organization, they can look at that directory. So I highly encourage you to be part of that membership directory. Also want to let you know, after 10 years and hundreds of luncheon education program, I'm finally turning over the reins to a new generation of young and vibrant people who are going to be putting on these luncheon education programs in 2018. Ben King of Loeb & Loeb is going to be the head chair for the education committee. So if you have any ideas or thoughts for programs that might be good for this organization, please reach out to Ben King from Loeb & Loeb. So today's program is Minority Interest in Commercial Real Estate. Learn how to value and sell in a receivership and a bankruptcy. The program is being put on by Todd Wolh from Braun Properties. Todd is a real estate broker. We've used him on many of our projects, and he always exceeds our expectations, comes up with very creative ways to market the property, and most importantly, makes you look good with all parties and attorneys and judges. So Todd will be on the panel today. Joel Weinberg of Insolvency Service Group is the second member of our panel. And then James Hill of Sullivan, Hill, Lewin, Rez, and Engel is also here as well. So we have a very knowledgeable, experienced panel, and I look forward to hearing their presentation today along with all of you. So let me turn it over. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you. Despite the title that went out in the announcement, the program today, we're going to discuss a little bit broader concept. In addition to fractional interest in real estate itself, we're also going to expand the discussion to minority interest in the business entities, which in turn may own real estate assets underneath. So we'll be talking a little bit about limited liability companies, closely held corporations, limited partnerships, as well as tenants in common and other fractional interests in real estate. So as an initial consideration, if you're appointed a receiver or representing a receiver, the first consideration is what is the nature of the interest that is the asset of the receivership estate. And in most instances, some of the more problematic areas will arise with LLCs, but what you have to do when you're evaluating these assets, you have to look at the state of formation in the case of an entity. So if you got a Delaware corporation, you got to look at Delaware corporate law, or a California LLC. You got to look at California law that regulate the formation and any restrictions that might exist on the transfer of those interests. So with regard to limited liability companies, which is really probably the most dominant form of entity that's used in real estate investments these days, you have to look at the nature of the interests, which would be governed again by the law governing the state of formation of the LLC. And typically that law will also provide for the efficacy of restrictions on transfer of interests or buy-sell arrangements or things that may restrict the ability of the receiver to sell or transfer those rights. And you also have to look at the key documents that exist with regard to LLCs to determine what those rights are, what are the nature of the interests that are the property of the receivership estate. So you'd look at the operating agreement, the articles of formation, and sometimes there's even separate buy-sell agreements that may be freestanding outside either of the two documents. So it's important you get the universe of documents, understand the nature of what you have to sell. Similarly, with closely held corporations, again, you want to look at the law, the law of the state of formation. You want to look at the articles, the bylaws, any shareholder agreements, any restrictions that may exist on the share certificates themselves, and also probably consult with a securities lawyer to make sure there aren't any securities laws restrictions on the transfer of shares. And with limited partnership and general partnership agreements, again, you look to the state law under which the partnership was formed, but there you would look primarily to the partnership agreement, whether it's a limited partnership agreement or a general partnership agreement. And finally, with regard to fractional sales interest in real estate, of course, you look to the law of the state where the real property is located to determine what is the nature of the interest. As you're probably all well aware, one of the more common vehicles today in investing in large real estate projects is selling off small fractional interests where you might have a dozen or more entities owning small fractional interests as tenants in common in a piece of commercial real estate. Jim, what are some of the common sorts of restraints that you'd find either with LLCs, partnerships, in terms of restricting the transfer of an ownership interest?
Yeah, well, one of the ones we see often in either LLP or LLC entities is a right of first refusal. In other words, don't sell outside of our group. If you're going to go try and sell this interest, you need to sell it back to our group or sell it back to the entity itself. But you'll also see all kinds of restrictions where people get real creative on transfers. Everything from a required discounted buybacks based on the actual capital, the actual book value. Things that are not necessarily tied to the real market value of the underlying property. And those are the kinds of restrictions that we find as the biggest challenges if we're representing a receiver or a trustee or a debtor in possession in a bankruptcy case. If we have a piece of property in the estate that's fractionalized interest or a minority interest in one of these entities, and we're trying to figure out how can we get maximum value out of it. And as Joel was saying, we start with the premise that the estate, the trustee, the fiduciary is going to get whatever the debtor had and no better. So we better drill down and find out, well, what is exactly there? Maybe some receiverships have judges who are more expansive in their interpretation of what they can do, but I think we're all in agreement up here that in receivership cases, there are less tools available to make a minority interest more marketable than compared to bankruptcy. And the reason I say that is several. One, in bankruptcy, when you're selling an interest, if you can get the court to determine that the restriction on transferability is what is referred to as an ipso facto clause, like is referred to in Bankruptcy Code Section 363L, a restriction that the court believes is unduly restricting the alienability of the share or the interest, it might not get enforced at all. And there's a lot of debate on when it's ipso facto clause and when it's a clause on a restriction on alienability that will be enforced. One of the things, I don't know if we're right at the point where we're going through bankruptcy
we haven't quite yet.
Yeah, but those are the primary restrictions that we find as our biggest challenge.
Yeah, one other thing that's kind of more unique to limited liability companies is that oftentimes if a member seeks to transfer an interest without the consent or outside the four corners of the document, sometimes there's an event of a dissociation. Mm-hmm. And so that what the transferee gets isn't what you think they're getting, and you have to be very careful here. For an example, they may not have any voting rights. They may not be entitled to any interim distributions. And in fact, that interest may only be entitled to receive a distribution in the event of a liquidation of the underlying entity. So you have to be very careful, depending on the state law that you're dealing with regard to limited liability company interests. And I think the important lesson is when you're talking about sales through a receivership, I think that the receivership courts are going to be more restricted by what applicable state law is in terms of the transferability of the interest, enforceability of the restraints on the transferability of those interests. Whereas in bankruptcy, there may be some ways around those problems, and we'll get to that in a moment. Yes, Alan?
Yeah, just a quick question, Joel. So you're saying that typically a receiver will be governed by the restrictions, like in an operating agreement, it says the sale to anyone outside is only of a voting, of an economic interest, not a voting interest. There's no way around that, whereas in bankruptcy,
Maybe.
There may be.
There's a big maybe on that.
Yeah.
But I mean, you might be able, to persuade a receivership court as a court of equity. If you have one of these situations where the only members in the LLC, for example, are all insiders, and they're saying, well, look, there's no reason then, and maybe there's some other creditors or some other party in interest that could have an economic interest if it's sold at the highest value. In those cases, you might be able to persuade the court that the restrictions on forcing the other members to have a non-consented member substituted in don't really apply, and therefore we're not going to enforce that. You might convince the court, maybe, but generally you're right. I mean, you're going to be stuck with the restrictions.
And I think we're in agreement that it's very fact intensive. Are you talking about a minority interest in a 6 to 10 member organization, or are you talking about a minority interest in a several hundred member organization? And as a practical matter, how much is, how important is that individual in the mix as a whole? And I think that's a practical point in a bankruptcy or a receivership.
Yeah, and before we move to bankruptcy, so you really have a couple of issues that that you have to consider. One, to what degree do the restraints on transfer apply in a receivership versus a bankruptcy? Two, is it possible, either in a receivership or bankruptcy, if there are problems with selling that interest itself, can you nevertheless force the sale of the underlying property in its entirety, and whereby the receivership estate or the bankruptcy estate would then get its pro rata portion upon the sale of the entirety? And that's probably something that's not going to happen in state law, but could happen in a bankruptcy. So having said that, Jim, why don't we take a look at what would happen in bankruptcy by comparison?
Okay, well, I just want to make sure we hit some of the restrictions and compare receivership to what is likely to happen in a bankruptcy, where I think we have an argument in bankruptcy, it's the opposite outcome. One, you mentioned a provision that might call for the dissolution of the entity upon certain events, and a receivership court may have to give effect to, a judgment returned not satisfied, events of insolvency, a failure of performance on capital calls and the like, a forced dissolution. That may be a real challenge for a receiver. Another one would be a discounted buyout clause, as I mentioned earlier, that's based on maybe capital paid in rather than market, or already defined formula for buyout, and again, the exclusive rights of just a few people to buy, and I think each of those are have a potentially different outcome in bankruptcy. Number one, I think that the first one I mentioned of a forced dissolution upon certain events like insolvency or filing a bankruptcy or some failure of performance conditions, they may not be enforced in bankruptcy because they're a classic ipso facto clause.
Well, let's break the bankruptcy. I think we should. There's a couple of gating issues you have to look at. So the first question is, when there's a bankruptcy filed, is notwithstanding all the restrictions in the interest, whether we're talking about a membership interest in an LLC, a limited partnership interest, and so forth. First question is, does it become property of the bankruptcy estate? And I think many courts are uniform in holding that, yeah, it does. I mean, it may be subject to all kinds of limitations, but those limitations, such as an insolvency event, ipso facto clause, doesn't preclude that property from becoming property of the bankruptcy estate. The real question is, all right, now it's property of the estate. What can you do with it? And can you get around those restrictions?
Okay, if you want to back up then to what do you have in a bankruptcy case? Well, an initial question we always ask when we're, say, representing a trustee on these limited partnership, and even LLC interest is it an executory contract or is it not? And courts are split on it, and they're also say it's very fact-driven. Okay, so in other words, if I have an interest in an LLP and my membership requires me to participate in management, and my interest requires me to respond to capital calls, and there's a plan for development of this property, and I have some active participation in it, it's more likely than not that that's going to be determined to be an executory contract. That can be good for a debtor or a trustee, because then you have an ability to assume and assign and pass on that interest to a buyer with some very powerful provisions in the code under Bankruptcy Code Section 365. You can cure certain defaults. You can transfer, and with a finding of assurance of future performance by the assignee, you relieve the debtor of any future obligations. So it could be really good. But a practice pointer for anybody in here who's represented a trustee in bankruptcy, and you have something that looks and smells like an executory contract, if it's in a 7, you've got a real short period of time to assume that contract, or it's deemed rejected. 60 days under 365D. 60 days. And as you know, when you get appointed in these cases, things go fast. And so if it's executory contract, you either want to assume right away, or you want to get an extension of the time to assume. If you get an extension of the time to assume, guess what? You may be obligating the estate as an administrative priority claim to pay those capital calls on an ongoing basis. So it's a real important analysis, quick, early in the case.
Yeah, one thing too that's important to distinguish here is how courts will treat the different kinds of interests. I think with corporate minority interests in corporations, not a big conceptual problem.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be treated as an asset subject to whatever securities limitations might exist on the transferability. Limited partnerships, general partnerships, again, not difficult for a bankruptcy court to deal with. They're going to treat it primarily as an executory contract. And the case law is somewhat more consistent there. limited liability companies is the one area where the bankruptcy courts have struggled, and the case law is all over the place on whether those interests can be transferred. Is it an executory contract or not? I mean, most courts agree it becomes property of the estate, whether they're going to go down the executory contract analysis or not. But then what you do with it, it just depends. It's like Jim says, it's very fact intensive. And the other thing with regard to the last category of things that we're talking about, which are fractional interests in real property themselves, such as tenant in common interests, the bankruptcy court does offer some very powerful tools that certainly don't exist as a matter of state law, or much more difficult to get there.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I was just going to conclude on the executory contract
Right.
discussion. We often don't want it to be an executory contract. We often want to say it's non-executory because it's like what Alan pointed out. No, it's an interest mostly in the profits and rents that are going to get generated here, and that's all we're selling here. And we as a trustee don't have an obligation to do anything material with that interest when we're selling it. We're just trying to sell the interest. And in the materials that we prepared for the program, we attached some pleadings and orders from a case that we ran in Nevada, where we were selling a mix of LLC, limited partnership, and other partnership interest using Todd's company, and again it was more, we were selling that right to income, that right to value, that capital, and we were able to avoid fights about was it already a rejected executory contract and the like.
Jim, while we're on the topic of bankruptcy, a lot of folks here may not be involved in bankruptcy work, may be more restricted to, serving as a receiver or participating in receivership cases. Why would a receiver care about bankruptcy? Why might it be an important thing to consider when you have these kinds of fractionalized interests or interests in entities?
Yeah, representing receivers, we're often early on knocking heads with the third parties who are, the managing members of these organizations. And so we need to know what our rules and tools are, both in receivership and bankruptcy in order to bargain away. We have to be able to sit down across the table and say, look, here's what we want to do. We want to put these assets up for sale. You've been arguing I can't sell them unless I sell them back to you, or you've been arguing about this formula buyout and everything else. If you're going to keep with that position, I'm going to let you know that you're going to see this in a bankruptcy case, and we'll get it done there. So I need to know those rules in order to get to often what is a consensual sale and a consensual process. And also something I've seen done rarely, and it's only in real larger cases, and maybe some of you who are receivers have seen this done in your own cases. I call it kind of the ultimate tactical nuclear weapon is you as a receiver can go to the receivership court and get permission to file a bankruptcy with you as the receiver in control of the whole process, as receiver being the debtor in possession. You need good, clear orders to get it done, but then you can take advantage of a lot of the things that the code provides. And one of them we alluded to and we passed right over it was, let's say you have a tenant in common interest, and you're a minority. You're not in control of the overall association that runs everything, but there's real value in the property if you can sell it as a whole. Real difficult to get done in a receivership, but you could, in a bankruptcy case, use provision 363H, potentially, it's hard, but you can get it done to sell the whole free and clear of your co-owner's interests, plural. You've got to give in that case, the co-owner does get a right to match the bids, but it's a process where you can take it to market and sell everything. You can't do that generally in a receivership case. But again, knowing the rules and tools of bankruptcy gives you some bargaining power and some leverage.
Yeah, particularly if you're, an equity receiver, you certainly could get authority from the appointing court to get authority to file a bankruptcy petition.
Right.
So, Jim, anything more you'd like to add on bankruptcy before we move on to some examples of
I don't think so. I think that's enough. Just that we've hit on, the power to get around ipso facto clauses. We can use 363 in an executory contract situation to do some really clean sales, and sometimes buyers are insisting on that cleansing mechanism, and 363 is how we sell property in a bankruptcy case. So, yeah.
Now, Jim, you were involved in a fairly large case that involved a number of different kinds of interests, both interests in LLCs, membership interests, as well as fractional interest in real property. Do you want to talk a little bit about that example?
The Desai case?
The
So
Desai case.
again, we did prepare some materials, and you ought to look at the motion for approval of a sale procedure and the order approving the sale procedure. We did that up front. And then after Braun ran its process, we went back in and did a motion to actually approve the sales following this really interesting auction process. And in this case, we call it our dirty doctor case. There was a very, very prominent physician in Las Vegas, Nevada, who ran endoscopy and colonoscopy clinics. And he was very wealthy, and he invested in lots of limited partnerships in the real estate heyday. So he had tons of these little fractionalized interests. That was not his main, financial wealth was not that, but it was a good part of his estate when he did file. Poor guy. He got a little greedy, ran his clinics a little bit fast, a little bit dirty, and ended up being accused of infecting a large number of patients with hepatitis C and other really bad diseases because he didn't clean the equipment fast enough, okay? And 40,000 people in the Las Vegas area were noticed to come in and get tested. And of course, while that's getting the media attention, the clinics are shut down immediately. And so he went from being prominent physician to being criminally prosecuted. He ended up getting convicted of murder and reckless endangerment, spent time in jail, and ended up dying in prison. So in the meantime, Todd came in. And we were liquidating the estate. And so we had all these fractionalized interests to be sold. And we started contacting the general partners, the managing members, and we started having these fights and discussions about, can we sell this stuff? And it really wasn't the bulk of the estate. And our trustee was very skeptical of value, and indeed, he thought we would be lucky to get out of these minority interests maybe $20,000. So just keep that in mind when we sent out an RFP to several different firms to come up with a process and help us sell them. And so, Todd, it's your time. You responded to the RFP, and you came back to us with a program for sale of these interests that was very different than what we're used to, maybe receivers are used to, of where, we're going to do an auction, a call auction in court or elsewhere, where, maybe we'll have an initial bidder, maybe we won't. We put the asset for sale, and people make their bids, and a gavel's dropped, and you walk out. We didn't do that.
So as a further introduction, Todd, so once you've worked through all of these legal issues and now you got something to sell, Todd, tell us a little bit about what you've done. Talk about the Desai case in particular, if you'd like.
Well,
How can you help us?
my middle name is not Mortician, so I just want to start with that. Prefacing Desai, I think talking about minority interests, however we all would define them, and how they're held. There's numerous ways of holding, as Joel's rightly described. Our process, which we call MIMEX, Minority Interest Market Exchange, and it is specifically to value and sell minority interests held in commercial real estate, and in some cases, very closely held businesses. But in this case, we're speaking about real estate. There's a lot of question that I get right out of the gate. How do you value a minority interest? Any of you that are here that may have crossed paths in the world of gifting estate and trust purposes, the IRS has a very defined, very specific methodology of valuation for what we call 706, 709 gifting purposes, of which we do this all by the hundreds a year. A question we get all the time is, well, are the IRS discounts relevant to what the market would be willing to pay for a minority interest? And they are night and day. There's no correlation whatsoever. Minority interests held are really held in what? In some sort of entity that has real estate as the main asset. So the value, starting with the value is the real estate. People are going to look at this potential investment, the purchase, right? And we'll speak about the Desai case. We may be selling a 32% interest, but a 32% interest in what? In a shopping center in Toledo, Ohio, in an apartment building in Encino, California. That's the value, that's the asset. And the analysis starts from that. And with that, we kind of either top-down or bottom-up approach in providing that information to the buyers so they understand what it is that they could buy. So that question of valuation is truly, what is the market willing to bear? No correlation to IRS valuation metrics, which of course is the kind of the metric in discount valuations. Process, we came up with the Desai, and the Desai sale was very much tailored to the situation that Jim and the trustee came with us, to us for. And considering many of these interests were very small, in some cases 2, 3, 4%, we had very difficult times getting the materials, meaning the due diligence information. Very difficult. What was the property? Where was the property? Was it generating any income? I mean, it was basically, Jim said, Todd, here's what we got, go figure it out. And we had to try to figure out, from our perspective of marketing these interests, what's the best process to market them, and then who's our buyer pool going to be? First, the question was, how are we going to market the interests? As Jim alluded, this is, of course, in his case, a bankruptcy sale. We were structuring an auction. But in the Desai case, and the materials are in the online materials that Tony put together, you can access. You may have them here in front of you. We put together a what we call a sealed bid auction, but it was tiered. So we had a round one, what we call qualifying round bid process, and round two, highest and best. The purpose of driving this process of bidding was first to understand who were going to get to buy these interests and what interest there was. And that would help us and Jim and the trustee figure out the strategy in round two, and maybe we only end up with a buyer for one of the interests. And I think, and Jim, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, were there 30 plus, 40 plus interests that we were selling?
More like 40.
40 plus interests. So, and then I think there's one or two properties that we were selling the fee simple in of as well. So we analyzed the process being bankruptcy. Yes, we wanted to use a tiered auction platform. So then there would not be, and I have to refresh my memory, I don't believe we had overbidding, did we? Or were we finalized? Our sale was final.
It was fine. We had phase one, if you will.
Qualifying round.
Qualifying round. And then you and the receiver sat down and identified the top third bidders.
Correct.
In each of the tranches. So only the top third of the bidders were invited to participate in the final
highest
round.
and best.
And again, this was all sealed. There's no one sitting in a courtroom knowing what the other people are bidding. And you convinced us that was a good thing. against a skeptical trustee, okay?
Yes, we had a lot of pushback, and the reason why I wanted to do a sealed bid sale, I'm sure most of you are familiar with different types of bidding platforms, or I would call it auction platforms, live, open outcry, sealed bid, online. I mean, there's so many different bidding platforms. The reason we chose sealed bid, and it's in many cases of specialty real estate that we sell the fee simple interest in, we use sealed bid because we either believe, A, there's not going to be a big buyer pool in the property, or in this case, the interests. So there's going to be a very small buyer pool. So in an auction, what do you need to create an auction setting?
2 or more.
A frenzy, 2 or more. Well, that's very true. There's some auctioneers, me included, that could say, all you need is 1. And in this room, no, you need 2 or more. So we believed that that for many of these interests, there may be only 1 or 2 bidders. And a sealed bid approach was the best way to effectuate and maximize the value. Why? Because all the other bidders, they didn't know who they were competing against, and they, of course, didn't know what the bids were. And it is very common in our standard sales that we do in Braun and in Premier Estates that we are going to have a very small pool of buyers. They're very high dollar properties, 10, 20, 30, $40 million. And there may be 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 buyers. So we have to structure that bidding platform so we are not leaving money on the table for the estate. In the case of Desai, we used the qualifying round, sealed highest and best round, for those very specific reasons. I want to go back to the information. Information in the case of Desai was very, very limited, as I said. But to maximize value, if one of you had a case, the first thing I would say is either hire a forensic accounting firm, speak with the managing member, the GP, whoever the party is that controls the flow of information on the property, the diligence materials. Those are all going to have an unbelievable important effect in how much we're going to extract for that interest. Because without that information, any buyer is essentially blind. And all they would have then is just the basic property, understanding the property, what it is, and then making some judgment call as to what kind of income they're going to receive over the life of the partnership interest that they're buying, and such as that. So obtaining information is key. A common question I get is, who are the buyers for these interests? Who are they? Where do they come from? Well, quite frankly, in this real estate market that we're in right now, it is unbelievably diverse. You want to buy a property in the California market, you might pay cap rates that are as low in the very low 2s. So people are looking for yield, and that yield is a perfect way to get in buying a minority interest in some form. So that minority interest is a great investment opportunity. In the case of Desai, we had very limited information. We finally, through I think it was a very long process, Jim was very helpful helping us get to the members.
Yeah, we actually had to use 2004 exams of a number of the managing members to extract information. Our debtor was under criminal indictment. His defense was, I am mentally incompetent to defend myself, so to stay consistent, you should have seen the depositions we had of him. They were useless. So yeah, we extracted the information, fed it to you, you put it in the data room, and I think the most valuable thing we obtained for you was the lists of members in some of these larger entities. So then you had your natural market, as you described.
So that natural marketplace was, of course, that existing buyer pool. And we have found in other situations unrelated to this that those buyer pool, those members, are the first people that want to know that they have an opportunity to buy. Makes sense, right? They're participating already, assuming they're happy with the returns and the investment. They want to be buyers. Many times the GP doesn't give us that information or is trying to buy that interest themselves and, of course, take advantage of an opportunity. We try not and don't allow that to happen. But in the case of Desai, we marketed this, the auction of these interests through, and there's information in your materials about it, but we marketed this through many of these typical real estate places that one would assume if you happen to want to sell a commercial property. We used certain wealth databases that we have and own. We used the Wall Street Journal, which was, if I recall, reasonably helpful. And then, of course, with social media and the internet today, quite frankly, we're as much a marketing company as we are anything else in the world of real estate. So finding buyers is a process. Marketing the auction that we did for Desai was a process-driven, date-driven. It was very structured. In the end, we had numerous buyers for many of the interests, and because of the structure that I put in place, which was the qualifying round, highest and best would be the top 33% of the bids received in qualifying. Those people were felt honored or lucky to get into that second round. And once they got into the second round, the guidance we gave them was, give us your highest and best. There was no guidance other than that. They did their own due diligence. And I have to say, we were all pleasantly surprised in many of the interests. If I remember, one of the buyers, I think, increased his bid by at least $100,000. It might have been 40 or 50% to get that interest. And in some cases, an interest may, not in this case of Desai we're speaking about, but it could take somebody from a very minority position to a majority position, hence even more value.
Yeah. So, I mean, in aggregate, the real difference in the aggregate was we went from the skeptical trustee value of about $20,000 to around $1 million.
$1 million.
Of proceeds. So it was
Yeah.
material, you know.
Yeah. It was very material. Yes, Kevin?
Todd, in selling minority ownership interest, if it's sold to a party outside the partnership and there's debt on the property, how do you typically deal with that? Just because I know some lenders have clauses about.
Well, Kevin, do you mean, are you talking about where the minority interest in question is actually a minority interest in the property itself, or an interest in an LLC or other entity that has underlying
There's
real property?
distinct difference between the
Because in the latter, you don't care.
Right.
Yeah.
Under
But-
an
but-
LLC,
but I
you don't
think you're-
care.
But not if it's an LLC membership interest you're transferring. You don't care what the mortgage, I mean, you may care from an economic point of view and the value of
Yes.
what you're paying. But from the lender's perspective, you know.
They don't care.
Not if you're selling a minority interest.
And then how about with individual ownership types of partnerships?
So you're speaking, let's just assume a TIC interest. So you own it directly, you own, let's say, a 1/3 interest in a property. That debt that would exist is, of course, yours, and if you're hypothetically the seller, that's going to be transferred to the new buyer. All of that information, of course, has to be disclosed, and that transfer has to be allowed by the documents, the loan documents that would be set in place. So they may or may not be assignable, and that lender may require essentially, or would trigger a new loan. That's possible. We have not seen that happen yet, though we're taking to market a third interest right now. Yes, go ahead.
I'm from Arizona, and I had that same exact situation. And the judge prevented us from doing it, and I went back and did the research, and I didn't realize it, but in Arizona, there's a statute that allows for it. So notwithstanding the due on sale clause in the loan documents, it didn't stop us. So I showed it to the judge, and in Arizona, because I don't know about California or Nevada, and they probably have similar statutes, and I was able to sell it subject to, it wasn't a tax.
It's subject to, not an assignment and release of the debt, right?
No, we didn't release the debt, so we said that we're selling this interest in the real estate. And then the lender didn't have an issue with it, but the judge did. And he said, well, no, it's due on sale clause, and even though the lender hasn't shown it to your sale, we can't do that. And in Arizona, there's a statute that actually allows for it. I'm sure there's one, if Arizona has it, and they usually mimic their, or they take their statutes from California.
It's possible, I'm just not aware of it. Al?
Joel, just one caveat on your comment about not caring too much if what is being sold is a minority interest, you know it's coming.
Yeah, I know where it's coming.
A minority interest in real property in an LLC where the property is encumbered, is you still have to look at and disclose what's in the loan docs, because often even if it's a permitted transfer under X percent, there's a fee chargeable. And
That's true.
Oh, yeah.
That's true.
I mean, there
Yeah,
could
and-
be lots of.
Right, and
No
obviously, if the
obligations.
interest violates the change of ownership provisions,
Right.
which is exactly where you're going. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that might go back to one other point. Common question I get is, what if there's a right of first refusal? How does that inhibit the sale? It's a question I probably get with almost every start of a conversation for an interest. How does a ROFR, a right of first refusal, affect doing what we do, or for that person trying to create that liquidity? And in our book, it doesn't have an effect in any way, shape, or form, in the sense that we have to disclose that there's a right of first refusal, because the operating agreement, whatever agreement that's enforced, we're providing to the buyers all the due diligence in a secure data room. They sign a confidentiality agreement. All that information is in place. We just say to the buyers that there's a right of first refusal, and that is part of the sale process. And if the GP or any member or whomever wants to take advantage of that right, well, that's their option to do so. But our process does not inhibit us doing what we do in any way, shape, or form. In the end, we look at mimics as being really a solution to create liquidity where the only other option has been, whether it's bankruptcy or receivership, the only other option is, I'm going to call the GP, I'm going to sell my 12% interest back to him or her. I probably believe that I'm going to get absolutely shellacked in what they're willing to pay, and I guess that's my only option. And this is not the case. And for some of you in this room that are lawyers, have probably gotten involved in litigation, people arguing over the value of that interest, and hiring people like us that are appraisers to appraise the interest, go through this long process. In the end, Mimics handles the solution. Just take it to market and find what the market's willing to bear. And
With that restriction.
with those restrictions, whatever they may very well be, and those are the caveats that the buyers have to adhere to. And in the case of Kevin's question on existing debt for a TIC, it's just part of that acquisition process and that analysis. And another question, in the case of Desai, we were lucky enough to have Jim and his team create that sales contract, the transfer document from the bankruptcy estate to the new buyer. In non-bankruptcy or receivership-related situations, it is an assignment document provided by the seller or seller's counsel for the buyer, and it's between the membership or the GP holder and that minority seller, and there's that sale transfer between them. It's an assignment document. So they're taking over that interest, assuming it's a GP. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and actually, in the Desai materials, you'll see the contract. You have to dig down into these materials. We didn't make them easy for you to get through. You'll see the bidding contract that the bidders
Yes.
had to sign, and the final sale document. And for you receivers and trustees, you'll see all kinds of exoneration language and indemnity language that says, hey, I'm selling this as is, and after we close, you have to indemnify me, the receiver seller, trustee seller, for any claims that might arise in the future out of this investment. So I mean, there's a lot of protection clauses built into our sale process and the sale documents.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There are going to be times, Desai is a good example, where we had very limited information and we all needed a lot of protection, like we all do. In some situations that we're dealing with now, they aren't court-driven in any way, shape, or form, so it becomes the liability of the seller and of the general partner, assuming we're speaking some sort of entity, to provide those documents and that underwriting material and partnership agreements and tax returns. And you'll see what we ask for in the materials that are sitting on your desk in front of you. We ask for a lot of information from the seller so we can at best maximize the value. In the end, it's all about what? Return, money. So the seller wants to maximize that. We put the onus on them to give us as much information on the interest and the entity that holds those interests, and that is very important. Tax returns, K-1s, partnership agreements, as I said, profit and loss on the property, leases for the property itself. It'd be just as if you were buying the fee simple interest in the property. So very, very, very valuable. Very valuable. Any thoughts?
maybe open for questions.
We'll open it up for questions if anybody has any.
Anybody?
Or any new bright ideas on selling this stuff. You know, we'd all like to take it home. But again, this process worked well for us. We will definitely be using it again. You know, every case is different, but all of us will see a lot of these membership interest in liquidation cases from time to time.
I suspect we're going to see a lot more, Todd, with retail commercial real estate.
Commercial real estate. Yes, Al?
I do have one question. You'd mentioned the concept of trying to convince a receivership court to sell the full entity or the full property when there's only minority interest owned. I can't quite imagine that argument flying. I guess you can't either.
No, I think, Alan, what I was saying, I can't imagine them selling the underlying real estate. What I can imagine a receivership court doing is if you have restrictions in the LLC, for an example, the operating agreement, on rights of first refusal, appraisal rights and all of that, if they're all family members, you know, you might convince a court that, you know, let's just go to the market and not comply with these because these guys are all in it together and you're not protecting innocent third-party investors. That kind of an argument, it worked in some of the bankruptcy cases. Might be able to convince a receivership court in that limited situation, again, smaller, fewer holders, et cetera. But I agree with you with the underlying real estate.
Well, I think there's one more point, whether it's relevant to your question or not, Alan. I'd say probably in dealing with what I've been dealing to date with minority interests, probably 80% of the time, we're going to receive unsolicited offers on the fee, on the property itself. Absolutely. And then we just pass it along to the parties, and they're going to say, hey, wow, we just, you know, here's a price that we didn't expect. And do they decide to sell it, and it settles a bigger question? That's a possibility. We don't solicit them. We're not marketing it that way, but it's common. It's common to happen. So, I mean, the reality is you never know. And in the end, again, as we always say, it comes down to money. So the solution of the process of selling minority interests, I actually think with one of the, I think it was the American Bankers Association came out with, and it may be sitting in this document in front of you, that the wealth transfer in the next 15 years of minority interests held in commercial real estate will be in the trillions. It's how most people own commercial real estate, in some sort of interest. They don't own the fee. If you wanted to own this building and you wanted to invest in it, you put in $1 million and you own 1% interest, hypothetically. What do you do when you want to sell that 1% interest? That wealth is going to transfer. And minority interests, the value of minority interests are just astronomical in the sense that the number of people and entities that hold them. So I suspect in our world of receivership and bankruptcy, we're going to see a lot more interest be a factor as an asset that you're all going to have to deal with. Because quite frankly, it's just so common. So who knows? We'll see. Yes? Okay.
I just wanted to see, are the traditional marketing platforms like LoopNet, are they open and receptive to?
So a question, that's actually a good question. Kevin's question was, is LoopNet, as an example of a listing service, receptive in marketing a minority interest? LoopNet doesn't even have a category for it. We have done it. We're very good at, kind of weaving through the process of how to market and how to establish what we're selling. The reality is for us, in doing so that we've done in the past, we want the phone to ring. We want to get the calls. We want the questions. We want interest. So, and look, we all know in the world of marketing, people just don't read. They would rather just pick up the phone or flip an email or something to the effect and ask a question. We use LoopNet. We use all the standard, what you would assume standard commercial real estate marketing tools in selling minority interests. But additionally, as I said, we also have to look to the localized market for that wherever that property is. Again, to us, we start with the property and then we work up. The private equity world, syndicators, there's so many different types of investor bases that exist out there that I'm sure you all deal with that are looking for yield. So we reach out to all of them. That is, quite frankly, the biggest job.
So when you're on LoopNet, Todd, how
Yes.
do you distinguish your minority interest from those? There is no category.
There is no category, so there'll be an other, and what we'll do is we will put it in. So let's say it was a retail shopping center, and it's 1 million square feet, and we're selling 12% of it, hypothetically, right? We'll go under retail, we'll go in that category, and then we will put all the information of the property, and write in bold in the description, it'll say 12% interest in the LLC that owns 4232 Main Street, and it's this, and this. The
Did you guys
solic-
talk to LoopNet about creating a category for that?
No, don't need it. And with the issues that LoopNet and CoStar are going through right now, it's not even worth the aggravation. So, but yes, marketing is a key component. And, we even have a specific website, and if you go into Google or Bing and you type in minority interest, real estate minority interest sales, there'll be a lot of information out there. So thank you all for coming. On behalf of Joel and Jim, we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you again.
Thank you for the last year.